The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everybody, it's Tom. Hey, I know you all have very busy schedules, so I wanted to thank you ahead of time for taking time out in your schedule to join me this morning. I hope you'll find this webinar informative. I'm currently the technical manager here at ERA, and I'm also the current chair of TNI's Stationary Source Audit Sample Expert Committee. 2 years ago, the privatization of the Stationary Source Audit Sample Program began. At that time, I presented a webinar to introduce the program to all participants. The past 2 years have been a learning curve for all the stakeholders, including the providers, testers, facilities, labs, and regulatory agencies. Today's webinar will be a follow-up on that introduction. I'm going to discuss the origin of the program and detail the program requirements, specifically the ordering and reporting process for audit samples, for anybody with us today who's new. I will also go over the required testing methodologies for labs, review some statistics thus far in the program, show the relationships between the facilities, the labs, the testers, the regulators, and the providers, and review some of the issues that have arisen during the conducting of the program. I'll also discuss the Stationary Source Audit Sample Expert Committee and their role in the SSAS program. The Expert Committee is always looking for new members to join us. We're especially looking for new regulators to join. Our committee conducts teleconference calls roughly once a month. If you're interested in participating, please contact me. If you should have questions as a result of our webinar, I'll supply my contact information at the end of this webinar. So let's begin. First, a little bit about ERA. ERA was founded back in 1977. We are a provider of certified reference materials, proficiency testing standards, and custom standards to the environmental testing and pharmaceutical industries. We're located in Golden, Colorado, right at the foothills of the beautiful Rocky Mountains. ERA services more than 7,000 laboratories in more than 80 countries. ERA is accredited by A2LA to ISO 17043 and 17025, and also ISO Guide 34. We are registered as an ISO 9001 organization and accredited as a PT provider by TNI. ERA produces CRMs and PTs in a variety of matrices, including air and emissions, wastewater, drinking water, soils, microbiology, radiochemistry, and we also have an entire line of custom standards. So if you don't see what you want in our catalog, give us a call. We can make anything you want. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about the EPA Final Rule for the Stationary Source Audit Program. We'll talk a little bit about what it is, some of the background, and why we've gotten to and where we've gotten to so far. I'll discuss TNI's SSAS Table, which details the Analytes, Methods, and acceptance limits. We'll talk a little bit about the audit sample timeline, which is one of the issues we've been having so far in the program. We're all going to also talk about SSAS Process. It's a pretty complicated process, but I think I can simplify it pretty well for you. We'll go through the details of how to order the samples and report the samples. And then we're going to discuss some important notes that have come up during the course of the program that I think will help to answer some questions that we've had so far. So first, where did the SSAS program come from? Okay. So back on September 13th in 2010, EPA restructured the Stationary Source Audit Program Final Rule. The program provides criteria to assure that the analyst and the field testing personnel are sufficiently capable of conducting emissions testing for compliance with the Clean Air Act requirements. Audit samples must be analyzed along with the samples collected while testing for regulatory compliance. This analysis helps the regulatory agency determine the validity of compliance test results. The changes finalized in this rule allow accredited providers, and not EPA, to supply the audit samples and require sources to obtain and use these audit samples obtained from the accredited providers instead of EPA, as was the former practice. In addition, this action moves the requirements for audits from EPA's rules laying out individual emissions test methodologies to generalized requirements in the general provisions of the Clean Air Act. In doing this, TNI then formed the Stationary Source Audit Sample Expert Committee, who wrote documents to help standardize the requirements of the program. Once those documents were written and approved, it was then time to find people, providers, to provide samples for the program. So a little bit about the SSAS program. Okay, stationary sources, or stacks, are routinely sampled and tested to ensure that emissions from these sources do not exceed defined MCLs in support of the Clean Air Act. Test samples are collected from these sources and sent to a laboratory for testing per an approved air testing method. To ensure that the laboratory is providing accurate test results, an audit sample is sent along with the test samples for evaluations. The audit sample is an emulation of the test sample matrix, but with a known value of the analyte of concern. The value is known to the provider and not to the laboratory. The laboratory must test the audit sample at the same time using the same personnel and the same methods as the test samples. This is a very important requirement in the SSAS program. You need to make sure that the laboratory is using the same personnel, using the same methods, and running them at the same time as the test samples from the site. Those audit sample results are reported for evaluation based on a predetermined set of criteria. The results of the audit sample are used by regulatory agencies to help determine the acceptability of the test sample results from the stationary source. The audit sample program, again, was historically administered by the US EPA. As with the proficiency testing program back in 1999, the EPA decided to privatize the audit sample program. The privatization of the stationary source audit sample program began back in June of 2013. In order for an audit sample to be included in the program, at least 2 providers of these samples must be accredited to provide samples. There are currently 2 providers available for a number of samples on the SSAS table. We'll discuss the SSAS table shortly. So right now, there are currently 9 Impinger solutions and 3 filter samples available in the program. We're going to discuss all of those so that we know which samples do require audits, which tests don't require audits. So audit sample designs, the methods, the concentration ranges, and the acceptance limits can be found on the stationary source audit sample table, revision number 5, which became effective in April 15th of 2014. We're going to discuss that briefly. And again, the SSAS program has established an expert committee which is comprised of stakeholders from the government, from stack testers, from laboratories, and provider communities, so that everybody involved in the SSAS program, everybody involved in compliance, has a say in how the program works. So as I had discussed, the samples that are included in the SSAS program are listed on what's called the SSAS Table. So this table can be found on TNI's website at www.nelac-institute.org under the SSAS program. What's really important to look at for this SSAS table is this details which samples can be provided. it also has a whole host of information that's beneficial not only to the testers, but to the laboratories. So there's some information on here that's critical for us to know. Okay, if we look at under the Analyte catalog, column, it lists not only the analytes that are associated, but the specific EPA air methods that must be utilized for the tests. So if we look at the top line, we look at sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide can be run either by EPA method 6 or EPA method 8. Alternative methods are not allowed unless pre-approved by your regulator. Then it has a concentration range, so it gives the laboratory an idea about where to expect the concentration of the sulfur dioxide. So if we look at the concentration range, it says somewhere between 50 and 2,000 milligrams per dry standard cubic meter. It's really important to understand as a laboratory what units you're reporting in. So part of the acceptability of your test results is to make sure that you're reporting in proper units. Then the next column lists the acceptance criteria for that analyte. Now some have fixed acceptance limits throughout the range, and some have varying limits depending on the concentration of the sample. So you can see here what the acceptance limits would be. Due to that concentration range and acceptance criteria, the last column lists what's called an audit sample reporting limit, or ASRL. What that reporting limit is if the sample were made, the audit sample were made at the absolute lowest concentration, that would be the lowest value you could report and still receive an acceptable value in your evaluation. So that will help you to determine if you're reporting a value below that something's wrong with your analysis and you would want to take a look at your results and see where you may have made a mistake. So as you can see, right now there are samples available for several Impinger solutions and several filters. So here's a listing of the audits of the analytes that are involved in the SSAS program. So I want to discuss those analytes and the specific methods. These are the various samples that are available in the SSAS program and the methods that need to be reported for those. And remember again that you need to run the sample by the method listed. If you're using any method other than that listed on the SSAS table, it has to be approved by your regulator before you can report that method. So we have metals on filter paper by EPA method 29. Metals in Impinger solutions, also by EPA method 29. We have mercury on filter paper by EPA method 29, and mercury in Impinger solutions currently by EPA methods 29 and 101A. We have lead on filter paper and lead in Impinger solutions, both by EPA method 12. Hydrogen halides by EPA methods 26 and 26A. Fluoride in Impinger solution by methods 13 and 13A. Oxides of nitrogen in Impinger solution by EPA method 7. Sulfur dioxide in Impinger solution by methods 6 and 8. And sulfuric acid, sulfur dioxide in Impinger solutions by EPA method 8. Now we recognize that there are, for some methods such as method 29, where there are a series of Impinger solutions, so that the laboratories do not have to run 5 or 6 different Impinger solutions. One main solution is chosen as the audit sample. So with the audit sample, you won't be receiving a series of rinse blanks or Impinger blanks, things like that. You're going to be receiving a main solution that as closely emulates the Impinger solution as possible. So for some of those methods, such as mercury and metals, where there are 5 or 6 potential solutions, please remember that you will only receive one solution. Okay, as I discussed, the program has been going on for a little over 2 years now. So we've collected a whole bunch of data for that, and I'd like to go over some of the statistics for that so far. So for EPA method 12, we have a very, very good success rate of 99% with 101 data points currently reported. For method 29 metals, we have a 98% pass rate, and there's 1,725 data points already reported. For mercury by method 29, we've got 163 data points and a 96% failure rate. So these are the three filter solutions that are available. And as you can see, these filter solutions all have a very high success rate. Part of the Stationary Source Expert Committee's responsibilities is to review these acceptance limits. We also want to review the audit sample concentrations that are being requested by testers. And the reason we want to do this is we want to continue to evaluate and update the concentration ranges to make sure that they're appropriate for what's being asked. And we also want to make sure that the acceptance limits are appropriate for the methods being used. So that's what part of the responsibility of the SAS committee is, that we continually look at this. So we see that for the most part, the filters, very good success rates. So let's take a look at some of our Impinger solutions. So the metals, still very good success rate in the Impinger solution of 99%. Also lead, 99% pass rate. Mercury, 98% pass rate. So far, data's looking real good. Sulfur dioxide, we're seeing a 95% pass rate by method 8. Hydrogen chloride by method 2626A, 94% pass rate. Sulfur dioxide by method 6, 92% pass rate. Hydrogen fluoride by method 2626A, 88% pass rate. Fluoride by method 13A and B, 86.5% pass rate. And sulfuric acid by method 8, that's 80% pass rate. So what we do is we take a look at these pass rates. We want to make sure that the sample, the audit sample itself, and the acceptance limits are providing an adequate challenge for the laboratories, but not too much of a challenge. So one of the things I see here, if I see over a 90% pass rate, I think that we've either got some really good labs going on, or we're not adequately challenging the labs with the acceptance limits. And I think in talking with the SAS committee, the acceptance limits, the acceptance criteria look pretty good. We're going to continue to evaluate them, but it's telling me that the laboratories that are running these tests are good quality laboratories and that they're providing a good analysis for us. If we look at the fluorides, got a little bit lower acceptance limit, acceptance rate, but as a lot of you that run fluoride know, we're running it mostly by ion chromatography. Ion chromatography has its share of issues with the water dip and the fluoride peak. So to see a little bit lower pass rate, not a concern to us. And then we look at the sulfur dioxide, the sulfuric acid for method 8. We see a lower failure rate, a higher failure rate, a lower pass rate than we see in a lot of the other ones. Still 80%, fairly decent. But we want to take a look at that and say, why is that so much lower than everything else? So what the SAS committee, the expert committee, is doing right now is we're evaluating all the data that's been reported for the program, the 177 data points, to see, is there something going on there that's causing a higher failure rate? Is the method not appropriate? Is the challenge too much? Are the laboratories not doing a good job with it? So we don't want to just say, hey, something's wrong, and we want to say, well, it's the labs, or well, it's the sample, or we want to make sure that we adequately evaluate, is that appropriate, is it not appropriate? So that's what we're looking at right now to determine, do we need to reevaluate the concentration range? Do we need to reevaluate the acceptance limits? Do we need to take a look at the method? Is it appropriate for that? So let's go into the audit sample timeline a little bit, okay? So one of the questions we get quite often from testers is, how far in advance do I need to order these audit samples? Okay, so the standard indicates that placing the order 21 to 30 days before the sampling event is adequate, as long as prior approval regarding the order has been received from the appropriate regulatory agency. Okay. Next question I get is, well, why so far ahead of my sampling event am I ordering the samples? When we first started the program, we got a lot of phone calls, people saying, hey, I'm going to be out at the site next week, I need a sample. And we tell people, yeah, guys, we need 21 to 30 days before you order a sample, before your event that you need to order the sample? Well, let me give a couple of reasons why we need to order so far ahead of time. Okay, there's a process that goes on. So the tester and or the facility will send the audit sample order to the provider. No big deal. As a provider, we can get samples out the next day if we want to. That's what our business is. But there's certain hoops that we have to jump through first. Okay, so the provider, according to the standard, has 5 business days to contact the regulatory agency, because when an order comes into us, we have to clear that order, that concentration of the audit sample with the regulatory agency ahead of time before we can send the sample out. So according to the standard, we have 5 days to do that. ERA as a provider generally contacts the regulatory agency the same day that we get an order sent to us. Here's the hard part right here. The regulatory agency has 15 calendar days to respond to the provider. So the regulatory agency has to say, yes, I'm okay with the concentration that the tester is requesting, or no, I'm not okay. And in the event that the regulator is not okay, we have to then try to choose a different sample or a different concentration based on the calculation tool. And we'll take a look at that calculation tool a little later. So part of that 21 to 30 days is that the regulatory agency has 15 days to respond. Now, we've had some tremendous success with some of the state regulators who get back to us right away, and then we can proceed with the shipping of the sample. We have some regulatory agencies that aren't very good about getting back to us. So if that 15-day period expires and the regulator hasn't gotten back to us, the provider can then ship the sample that they have sent and requested to the regulatory agency, but that's already 15 days. So there are some agencies that are much more involved in the program and some that aren't as involved in the program. Some of them just let the time lapse. Some of them, as a lot of you are well aware of, are just overstuffed with data. They're overstuffed with work and they can't get back to us as quickly as some of the others. So that's one of the major bottlenecks right now. Once we get approval from the regulatory agency, the provider will then ship the sample directly to the facility. We don't ship it to the laboratory, we ship it to the facility where the sample will be tested. Okay? Excuse me. So here we have an audit sample process flow chart, which basically gives us a flow of the entire program. It shows everybody's involvement from the facility to the laboratory to the provider to the regulatory agency to the stationary source tester. Okay? Pretty busy screen there. So what I'd like to do is kind of simplify this. This is the entire process of the SAS program. So what I'd like to try to do is to simplify that a little bit for you. Okay, there's 8 major steps right now in the process. Okay, step number 1, tester orders the audit samples from ERA or another provider. Step number 2, ERA then contacts the state regulator where the sampling is going to be done. Step number 3, the audit sample gets shipped to the tester, usually at the facility, or the tester brings the samples to the facility when they do the testing. Step number 4 in the process, the tester will collect the sample and then send the audit sample to the laboratory along with the test samples. Step number 5, the laboratory analyzes the audit samples in their batch. Step number 6, the laboratory will then report the audit sample results back to ERA or their other provider. ERA then reviews the results and compiles the report. Step number 8, ERA then will release the reports. According to the TNI standard for SAS, we have 3 days to release those reports. The reports are released simultaneously to the laboratory, the tester, the facility, and the regulatory agency. So what I'd like to do is show you the relationship between all the parties involved and where we are in each of the 8 steps of the process. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So R is our regulator, T is the tester, F is the facility, L is the laboratory, and then we have ERA as the provider. So step one, we have our tester, orders the samples, sends that sample order to ERA. Okay? ERA will then contact the state regulator and say, here's what the tester is recommending for this particular site. The regulator then has a relationship back with ERA and says, yes, I think that's appropriate for the test site, or no, I don't think it is. Can you give me a different recommendation? Okay, once the approval has been done with the regulator, okay, ERA then interacts back with the tester and ships the audit sample to them. Step 4 of the process, the tester at the facility then sends the audit sample along with the compliance samples to the laboratory. So that's their relationship with the laboratory. Step 5 of the process, the laboratory then analyzes the audit sample in the same batch along with their compliance samples. The laboratory then has a relationship back with ERA as the provider to report those audit sample results to us. Step 6 of the process. ERA then reviews the results and compiles the reports, which is step 7. Then step 8 is ERA's relationship with all the stakeholders, the regulator, tester, facility, and laboratory. We release those results. We are required to do that again within 3 days of receiving the results, and we're required to simultaneously release the results to all 4 of the stakeholders. So there's the process in a nutshell. It's fairly simplistic. Okay, so let's talk about the audit sample calculation tool. So when a tester is getting ready to order an audit sample, TNI has a website, www.nelac-institute.org. On this website, in the SSAS Program link, there is an audit sample calculation tool where the tester can go in and see what they should expect to see from the stationary source itself. And what we want to try to do is to get an audit sample at a somewhat similar concentration to what our expected emission is going to be, so that the laboratory can then run the test samples and the audit samples in a similar fashion. So there's a certain number of pieces of information that need to be filled out. You'll pick your test method from a drop-down box. You'll pick your media, either filter or ampule. Ampule is what you want to pick if you're doing an Impinger solution. So once you pick your test method, the audit sample calculation tool automatically populates with the analytes of concern. If there's only one analyte, there's going to be one column. For something such as metals, it's going to give you 16 columns, one for each metal. Okay, what you want to do is you want to put in your expected, either your emission limit or your estimated in-stack gas concentration, one or the other. Input your stack flow rate, your sample rate, your sampling time, and your final diluted or concentrated volume. In this case, our default volume is 250. So input all that data, okay, and then click Audit Concentration. And if you see on the bottom, it's going to calculate an audit sample concentration. It lists the concentration range and then of an approximate order sample concentration to order. So in our example that we have here, our approximate concentration to order is about 70. So that's what you would provide, the information you would provide to your provider to help them determine what audit sample to send. Each of the provider is going to have a number of different batches available. So for sulfuric acid, there's going to be a number of different sample concentrations available. Your provider will pick a sample that as closely emulates the expected concentration, the calculated value, as possible. That's the number that we send to the regulator for their approval. So when it comes time to order your sample, you have a simple order form. There's certain information that you're going to need to fill out on that order form. First of which is your scheduled sampling event. We need to know the date of that sampling event so that we know how quickly we need to process your order. We never want you to have to either postpone or wait for your sample to do your sampling event. So this is where we'd like to see somewhere between 21 to 30 days ahead of time. And we always recognize that it's not always possible. Things pop up and all of a sudden you say, oh my God, I got a sampling event next week. We're going to do our best to try to meet an audit sample at the time that you're going to do your sampling event. So if it happens to be your sampling event's only 10 days away, we will work as hard as we can with the regulator to get that approval so that we can get the sample sent out. We can ship samples overnight to you, so all we need is a day to ship and then the rest of the time to try to work with your regulator. So please make sure you have a date of the sampling event. So then you next need to fill out what audit sample you want. So there's a list of the samples. There's the method that's involved. Please make sure that you relay to your laboratory this is the method that needs to be done. If it's a multi-analyte sample and you don't need all the analytes, please select which analytes you're going to have and specify the concentration. If you don't specify the concentration, then we don't know what to choose to send to the regulator for their approval. So please make sure you're filling out the specify analyte concentration section as well. Okay, then we have billing and payment information that needs to be filled out as well. Okay, then part 2 of the order form, select where you want the sample sent. And again, we can either send it to the tester or the facility. We cannot send samples directly to the laboratory because the samples need to be at the testing site and shipped along with the compliance test samples to the laboratory who's going to be doing the testing. Okay, we need to know the facility information. We have to have all of that in our database because when ERA as a provider takes test results and evaluates them, we have to take all that information and load it into what's called the SSAS Central Database so that all that data can be collected and used by TNI and also the SSAS Expert Committee to evaluate the program as time goes on. So we need all that information filled out as well. We need to know what laboratory is doing the testing so that we know who to expect data from. So please fill out the laboratory information. Fill it out with the laboratory that you're expecting the sample to go to. We recognize that sometimes things change, and by the time you get your sample and you get out to the test site, that the laboratory may change. If that laboratory information changes, just contact us and we'll update that in our system. Okay, we also need to know, and this is a very important piece of information, the regulatory agency. We need to know who to contact to get the approval of the audit sample concentration. Remember, again, we cannot send a sample out until we get approval by the regulatory agency or until that 15-day waiting period has expired. So that's essentially the process for you. I want to bring up a couple of things that have come along as part of the programs, things that we weren't expecting to happen but have, or important pieces of information that we'd like you to know. Okay, so unless approved by your regulatory agencies, audit samples must be ordered within the concentration range listed on the SSAS table. So if you go through that calculation tool and your calculated concentration is either below the lowest limit or above the lowest limit, if it's below the lowest limit, you need to order a sample at the low limit. If it's above the upper limit, you need to order a sample at the upper limit. So we cannot process any orders for SAS requests that are outside of the concentration range. Anything outside of the range is going to be evaluated as cannot evaluate, which means it's a meaningless sample. If your regulatory agency approves that, we can do that. And one of the reasons why we're allowing that to happen is that the SSAS Expert Committee is continually reevaluating whether the concentration ranges are appropriate. So even though we're reporting evaluations of concentration ranges outside of the range as cannot evaluate, we're still recording the data and we're taking a look at what the recoveries are outside of those ranges. In the event that we decide we want to expand, contract, or change the ranges, we need to have data to show us what acceptable limits would be if those ranges changed. So please keep that in mind. Also, the analysis of audit samples cannot be subcontracted to another lab. It's very important for you to make sure that the samples that you're sending to your lab, that lab is accredited to do that particular test. So if you're sending a method 29 audit sample to a lab, you need to make sure that that lab is accredited for method 29. They cannot subcontract that sample to another lab. As I had mentioned previously, there's times that the samples end up being sent to a laboratory other than the one that you provided on the order form. If that happens, please contact us and let us know with the change so that we can record that change. We have to tell the regulator within a certain period of time that the laboratory has changed for that analysis, and we need to be able to track that analysis. For the testers, for those of you testers that have more than one location for your offices, you have to have a TNI SSAS code for each location. So if you have an office in Knoxville, an office in Nashville, an office in Memphis, you need to make sure that you have a TNI SSAS code for each one of those offices. It's an important thing to note as well because we have to keep track of the SSAS codes. And again, before you send samples to a laboratory, please check with that laboratory to confirm that it's accredited for that analysis. There are going to be times when a laboratory receives more than one audit sample at a time. You could receive a method 29, a method 12, method 26. So if you're a laboratory and you have multiple audit samples, it is acceptable to report just one audit sample at a time. So let's say you complete your hydrogen chloride analysis, but you haven't completed your metals analysis. You don't have to wait and report all the results together. You could report the results for your hydrogen chloride sample before you finish your method 29 metal sample. So if you're a laboratory that doesn't want to wait or you don't want to forget something, you can report one, you go back into our e-data system and you report the second, report the third, report the fourth. You can do them all at the same time. It's perfectly acceptable, but we want you to know it is also acceptable to do them one at a time, whichever makes it easier for you. Another thing to remember is that audit samples do have an expiration date. We get questions a lot, and we have a lot of testers who like to order a bunch of audit samples ahead of time and then hold on to them to bring to certain sites for future testers, for future testing events. Okay, so that's perfectly acceptable to do, but please remember that an audit sample has an expiration date. So if you've got an audit sample, it has to be analyzed by the laboratory prior to the expiration date supplied by the provider. So each one of the providers is going to give you an expiration date on that audit sample. Let's say it's 1 year. So if you like to purchase your audit samples at the beginning of the year for your sampling events throughout the year, which is acceptable, you have to be careful that if you have a testing event at the end of the year and it gets delayed, you have to worry about the audit sample having an expiration date. So the results won't be valid for an audit sample run after it reaches its expiration date. If you have any questions regarding that, please give us a call. The SSAS table indicates required testing method. As I had mentioned previously, the samples have to be tested using the same method that is listed on the SSAS table. So that's why I presented you with a couple of slides of the approved methods for the SSAS samples. If you're going to use an alternative method, it must be approved by your regulator ahead of time. And some will approve, some won't approve. So be careful if you're running a sample, if you're considering running a sample by a method other than the one that's listed on the SSAS table. One thing we'd like to ask of all the laboratories reporting data is for method 8, many regulators are allowing analysis by ion chromatography. Now, if you look at the analysis section of method 8, it's a titration method. So when results come in for method 8 audit samples, the providers are calling the laboratories to ask them whether they're running the analysis by IC, ion chromatography, or by titration. One of the things that the SAS Expert Committee is doing in investigating the higher than normal failure rate for Method 8 is to see, is there an issue with the method? Are the failures higher by IC or by titration? In order to be able to do that, we're going to be asking that you list not only in the method section EPA Method 8, but put EPA Method 8 IC, EPA Method 8 titration. That will help us. If you don't, then we're going to have to call you for that. If there's any laboratories on the webinar right now, and sometime in the near future, you're going to be receiving some communication from the SAS Expert Committee for old EPA Method 8 audit samples that you've performed in the past 2 years. You're going to be asked to provide the Expert Committee with the analysis technique, IC or titration, so that we can do our evaluation of that method. So expect that. So if you expect that to come, and if it does, now you know why it's coming. Okay. One other thing, another question that I get is for results that require a dry gas volume. Those are ones that are reported in dry standard cubic meters. For the final calculation, we would like you to assume a dry gas volume of 1 dry standard cubic meter, because that's something that you need to take into consideration how much air is being passed through the sampling system, through the sampling train. And since this is a sample coming from a provider, there is no gas volume. So for your calculations, assume a dry gas volume of 1 dry standard cubic meter. So that concludes our webinar for today. Again, I thank you for spending your time with me. If you have any questions, please email me. I've listed my email address below, twidera@eraqc.com. I am more than willing to answer any questions you have, or if it's a question about something with concerns to a regulatory agency, I'm happy to try to talk to them for you. Also, if you would care to call, I didn't list it here, but our number is 800-372-0122. And again, if you're interested in participating in the SAS Expert Committee, you're more than welcome to join our conference calls as a guest if you want to see what's going on, if you're interested in becoming involved. If after participating in a few sessions as a guest, you say, hey, I'd like to be more involved in this, then you can consider becoming an Expert Committee team member. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for spending your time with me today, and I hope you all have a great day.